Good morning, friends. We're finally finishing Chapter 2. We have to remind our readers once again that this chapter does not attempt by any means to list all the waves which fertilized Gulag, but only those who had a political coloration. And just as, in the course of physiology, after a detailed description of the circulation of the blood, one can begin over again and describe in detail the lymphatic system, one could begin again and describe the waves of non-political offenders and habitual criminals from 1918 to 1953. And this description, too, would run long, but it would bring to light many famous decrees now in part forgotten, even though they have never been repealed, which supplied abundant human material for the insatiable archipelago. One was a decree on absenteeism. One was the decree on production of bad quality goods. Another was a samagon, moonshine distilling. Its peak period of 1922, but arrests for this were constant throughout the 20s, and the decree on the punishment of collective farmers for failure to fulfill the obligatory norm of labor days, and the decree on the introduction of military discipline on railroads, issued in April 1943, not at the beginning of the war, but when it had already taken a turn for the better, in accordance with the ancient Petrine tradition. These decrees always put in an appearance as the most important element in all our legislation, but without any comprehension of or reference to the whole of our previous legislation. Learned jurists were supposed to coordinate the branches of the law, but they were not particularly energetic at it, nor particularly successful either. This steady pulse of decrees led to a curious national pattern of violations and crimes. One could easily recognize that neither burglary, nor murder, nor samagon distilling, nor rape ever seemed to occur at random intervals, or in random places throughout the country as a result of human weakness, lust, or failure to control one's passions. By no means. One detected instead a surprising unanimity and monotony in the crimes committed. The entire Soviet Union would be in a turmoil of rape alone, or murder alone, or samagon distilling alone, each in its turn, in its sensitive reaction to the latest government decree. Each particular crime or violation seemed somehow to be playing into the hands of the latest decree so that it would disappear from the scene that much faster. At this precise moment, the particular crime which had just been foreseen, and for which wise new legislation had just provided stricter punishment, would explode simultaneously everywhere. The decree on the militarization of railroads crowded the military tribunals with the women and adolescents who did most of the work on the railroads during the war years, and who, having received no barracks training beforehand, were those mostly involved in delays and violations. The decree on failure to fulfill the obligatory norm of labor days greatly simplified the procedure for removing from the scene those collective farmers who were dissatisfied with receiving for their labor mere Labor Day points in the farm account books and wanted produce instead. Whereas previously their cases had required a trial based on the article of the code relating to economic counter-revolution, now it was enough to produce a collective farm decree confirmed by the district executive committee. And even then those collective farmers, although they were sent into exile, must have been relieved to know they were not listed as enemies of the people. The obligatory norm of labor days was different in different areas, the easiest of all being among the peoples of the Caucasus, 75 labor days a year, and despite that, many of them were also sent off to Krasnoyarsk province for 8 years. As we have said, we are not going into the lengthy and lavish examination of the waves of non-political offenders and common criminals, but having reached 1947, we cannot remain silent about one of the most grand law of Stalin's decrees. We have already mentioned the famous law of the 7/8 or 7/8, on the basis of which they arrested people right and left for taking a stalk of grain, a cucumber, 2 small potatoes, a chip of wood, a spool of thread, all of whom got 10 years. But the requirements of the times, as Stalin understood them, had changed, and the tenor, which had seemed adequate on the eve of a terrible war, seemed now, in the wake of a worldwide historical victory, inadequate. And so again, in complete disregard of the code, and totally overlooking the fact that many different articles and decrees on the subject of thefts and robberies already existed, on June 4th, 1947, a decree was issued which outdid them all. It was instantly christened 4/6 by the undismayed prisoners. The advantages of the new decree lay first of all in its newness. and from the very moment it appeared, a torrent of the crimes it specified would be bound but to burst forth, thereby providing an abundant wave of newly sentenced prisoners. But it offered an even greater advantage in prison terms. If a young girl sent into the fields got a few ears of grain, took along 2 friends for company, an organized gang, or some 12-year-old youngsters went after cucumbers or apples, they were liable to get 20 years in camp. In factories, the maximum sentence was raised to 25 years. This sentence, called the quarter, had been introduced a few days earlier to replace the death penalty, which had been abolished as a humane act. And then, at long last, an ancient shortcoming of the law was corrected. Previously, the only failure to make a denunciation which qualified as a crime against the state had been in connection with political offenses. But now, simple failure to report the theft of state or collective farm property earned 3 years of camp or 7 years of exile. In the years immediately following this decree, whole divisions from the countryside and the cities were sent off to cultivate the islands of Gulag, in place of the natives who had died off there. True, these waves were processed through the police and the ordinary courts, and did not clog the channels of state security, which, even without them, were overstrained in the post-war years. Stalin's new line, suggesting that it was necessary, in the wake of the victory over fascism, to jail more people more energetically and for longer terms than ever before, had immediate repercussions, of course, on political prisoners. The year 1948 and 49, notable throughout Soviet public life for intensified persecution and vigilance, was marked by one tragicomedy hitherto unheard of, even in Stalinist anti-justice, that of the repeaters. That is what, in the language of Gulag, they called those still undestroyed unfortunates of 1937 vintage, who had succeeded in surviving 10 impossible, unendurable years, and who in 1947 and 48 had timidly stepped forth into the land of freedom, worn out, broken in health, but hoping to live out in peace what little of their lives remained. But some sort of savage fantasy, or stubborn malice, or unsated vengeance, pushed the victorious Generalissimo into issuing the order to arrest all those cripples over again, without any new charges. It was even disadvantageous, both economically and politically, to clog the meat grinder with its own refuse. But Stalin issued the order anyway. Here was a case in which a historical personality simply behaved capriciously toward historical necessity, and so it was necessary to take all of them, though they had hardly had a chance to attach themselves to new places or new families. They were rounded up with much the same weary indolence they themselves now returned with. They knew beforehand the whole way of the cross ahead. They did not ask, "What for?" They did not say to their families, "I'll be back." They put on their shabbiest rags, poured some makorka into their camp tobacco pouches, and went off to sign the deposition. Only one question. "Are you the one who is in prison?" "Yes." "Take 10 more." At this point, the autocrat decided it wasn't enough to arrest just those who had survived since 1937. What about the children of his sworn enemies? They too must be imprisoned. They were growing up, and they might have notions of vengeance. They may have had a heavy dinner and had a nightmare about those children. They went through the list, looked around, and arrested children, but not very many. They arrested the children of the purged army commanders, but not all the children of the Trotskyites. And so the wave of the vengeful children came into being. Among such children were 17-year-old Lena Kosaryeva and 35-year-old Yelena Rakovskaya. In 1948, after the great European displacement, Stalin had succeeded once again in tightly barricading himself in and pulling the ceiling down closer to him. In this reduced space he had recreated the tension of 1937, and so in 48, 49, and 50 there flowed past alleged spies. 10 years earlier they had been German and Japanese, now they were Anglo-American. Believers. This wave was non-orthodox for the most part. Those geneticists and plant breeders, disciples of the late Vivolov and of Mendel, who had not previously been arrested. Just plain ordinary thinking people, and students with particular severity, who had not been sufficiently scared away from the West. It was fashionable to charge them with praise of American technology, praise of American democracy, and toadyism toward the West. These waves were not unlike those of 1937, but the sentences were different. The standard sentence was no longer the patriarchal 10-ruble bill, but now the new Stalinist 25. By now the tenor was for juveniles. There was a good-sized wave from the new decree on revealing state secrets. State secrets included such things as the district harvest, any figure on epidemics, the type of goods produced by any workshop or mini-factory, mention of a civil airport, municipal transport routes, or the family name of any prisoner imprisoned in any camp. For violations of this decree they gave 15 years. The waves of nationalities were not forgotten either. The Ukrainian nationalists, the Banderovsky, taken in the heat of struggle from the forests where they fought, kept flowing all this time. Simultaneously, all Western Ukrainian country people received tenors and fivers in camps in exile, presumably for having had connections with the partisans. Someone had let them spend the night, someone had once fed them, someone had not reported them. For about a year, starting in 1950, a wave of wives of Banderovsky was underway. They gave them each 10 years for failure to make a denunciation, so as to finish off their husbands faster. By this time, resistance in Lithuania and Estonia had already come to an end. But in 1949, new waves of new social prophylaxis to assure collectivization kept coming. They took whole trainloads of city dwellers and peasants from the 3 Baltic republics into Siberian exile. The historical rhythm was disrupted in these republics. They were forced to recapitulate in brief, limited periods the more extended experience of the rest of the country. In 1948, one more nationalist wave went into exile, that of the Greeks, who inhabited the areas around the Sea of Azov, the Kuban, and Sukhumi. They had done nothing to offend the father during war, but now he avenged himself on them for his failure in Greece, or so it seemed. This wave, too, was evidently the fruit of his personal insanity. The majority of the Greeks ended up in Central Asian exile. Those who voiced their discontent were thrown into political prisons. Around 1950, to avenge the same lost war, or perhaps just to balance those already in exile, the Greek rebels from Marcos' army, who had been turned over to us by Bulgaria, were themselves shipped off to the archipelago. During the last years of Stalin's life, a wave of Jews became noticeable. From 1950 on, they were hauled in little by little as cosmopolites, and that is why the doctor's case was cooked up. It would appear that Stalin intended to arrange a great massacre of the Jews, and this became the first plan of his life to fail. God told him, apparently with the help of human hands, to depart from his ribcage. The preceding exposition should have made it clear, one would think, that in the removal of millions and in the populating of Gulag, consistent, cold-blooded planning and never-weakening persistence were at work. That we never did have any empty prisons, merely prisons which were full, or prisons which were very, very overcrowded, and that while you occupied yourself to your heart's content studying the safe secrets of the atomic nucleus, researching the influence of Heidegger on Sartre, or collecting Picasso reproductions, while you rode off on your railroad sleeping compartment to vacation resorts, or finished building your country house near Moscow, the Black Marias rolled incessantly through the streets, and the Gebisti, the state secretary men, knocked at doors and rang doorbells. And I think this exposition proves that the organs always earn their pay. Have a good day, friends.